Well, it's now been 6 weeks since two of the Gupta brothers, Rajesh Gupta and Atul Gupta, were arrested and detained in Dubai at the request of our National Prosecuting Authority and our Justice Ministry for the crimes that they're accused of committing during the state capture era. Under the law under which they were arrested, we only have 60 days to submit a proper formal extradition application. In other words, we need to make sure all the paperwork is properly filed. The NPA says that it is on course to do that. Professor Thomashausen is an Emeritus Professor of International Law at the University of South Africa, at UNISA. Professor, good afternoon to you, and thank you for your time. How complicated are these procedures? What kind of application would we have to file in Dubai?
Yes, good afternoon, Stephen and listeners. No, it is not complicated. The extradition treaty with the UAE is a standard extradition treaty like there are hundreds around the world. There are no extraordinary or surprise clauses in there. The 60-day period is also something that is applied generally. In some countries it's shorter, it's only 30 days. But in this case, Article 14.5 determines 60 days to supply basically everything that a national prosecution would have to file in court to be able to conduct a trial. So the paperwork that they have has to be trial ready. There has to be a clear specification of the charges, what are these people believed to have done, when and where and how, and what evidence, and that has to be put before the authorities in the UAE in a clause often overlooked. It has to be filed in authorized legal translations into the official language of the Emirates, which of course is Arabic, and there may be a question mark whether translations executed in South Africa are acceptable in the Emirates. The general rule is that official and acceptable translations always have to be executed by people licensed to do so in the recipient country.
I suppose the equivalent of our sworn translator. Would you also have to prove that what the person is accused of is a crime in Dubai? Because different countries can have very different definitions of crimes in some cases.
Yes, that rule is in the extradition treaty, like in most extradition treaties, that the offense that you're accusing a person of has to be known, has to exist in the laws of the country requested to extradite. This way, countries want to protect themselves against extradition requests based on esoteric, on strange things that don't exist in their own law. But again, fraud or theft is basically what all this is about. Are crimes that are criminal offences anywhere in the world.
So we file all the paperwork, we get it translated, we get all of that filed. What happens then? There's a hearing like we've seen in the Shepherd Bushiri case in Malawi.
At first, in the case of the Emirates, there will be an examination by the Emirates authorities if they are satisfied that everything is complete and present. And if it is not, they will communicate the petitioning country, meaning South Africa. They will say, please, we cannot, for instance, read the warrant of arrest. It's a bad photocopy. Supply a legible photocopy, or any other defects. They say the translations you have furnished are not complete or are bad, and then the authorities have a discretion to grant an extension period. They can say, we give you another 2 weeks or 2 months to comply with this. The two countries can also agree on a delay, on an extension of the period, another 60 days if it has to be. But yes, the person that has been provisionally arrested, in this case the two Gupta brothers, they also have some fundamental rights, and they can approach the courts in the UAE and demand a review of their arrest. Once the UAE authorities are satisfied that everything they require to make an informed decision is before them, then they will grant or not the extradition request. Other than in the Bushiri or in the South African Cheng case, there isn't at this level a judicial inquiry. They do that simply as their own prosecuting authority. Once they decide to extradite, yes, then the people concerned these two Gupta brothers, they will have some legal remedies against this. And they can approach the courts in the UAE saying this is an abuse of power, or there are no valid grounds for the extradition. For instance, one of the big exceptions is there's no extradition if there is a suspicion that people are being sought for political reasons, or that the charges against them are politically motivated.
I'm sure we'll get an explanation of that argument from the Gupta lawyers at some point at their first opportunity. I'll put a lot of money on it. As I understand it, you're the professor of international law, not me, but as I understand it, in quite a few jurisdictions, there's actually a role for the head of state, that actually the sitting president or prime minister may make the final decision. That's because once you've extradited someone, you often can't get them back, as we found once in a famous constitutional court case, I think, involving Egypt. Who makes the final decision in the Emirates, then? Is there one person? I mean, here, I would imagine that judges might decide. Maybe our president decides. I actually don't know. How does it work in Dubai?
Now, Dubai, it's an executive decision, because it's an executive matter, so it's the Minister of Justice. They may have some internal rules and regulations whereby certain decisions have to be presented to the Council of Ministers, but normally it would not involve the supreme ruler in the Emirates. It's a matter for the Ministry of Justice. We have this thing in our Extradition Act, not by the treaties, in our Act, and it comes from the times before there were extradition treaties, that the president may be called to decide. But in our constitution, what we call president is actually a prime minister. It's just the chairman of the Council of Ministers. So that doesn't apply in the UAE.
And how much leeway, how much independence of mind would the person have, the Minister of Justice there or their equivalent? And I say this because, for example, at one point it was up to our Justice Minister whether the former Mozambican Finance Minister Manuel Chang, whether he went to Mozambique or whether he went to the United States. And in fact, when the power sort of changed within the ANC, a different Minister of Justice made a different decision. Could that happen in Dubai? And I sort of asked this because the Guptas have shown that they're very, very good at influencing politicians.
Well, they're investors. They're important investors in the UAE because they managed to bring an enormous amount of money for private people to the UAE. Many speculate that it's in the region of $30 billion, which would be about 700 billion rand. It could pay to settle the entire ESCOM debt, for instance, and relieve us from all our load-shedding worries. So it's a huge amount of money. So they're important investors, and there will be economic interests in not deciding lightheartedly. But I know the Emirates quite well. I've been working there as a so-called quality assurance expert for over 6 years. I've evaluated many federal ministries and state ministries there. The UAE administration is quite meticulous. It really follows the old English colonial tradition. Everything is done very, very accurately, from the filing to the way that decisions are prepared and considered. So the minister will apply his mind. He will look at the briefings before him. And in the case of a concurrent request where there's two countries wanting the same person, which was the case of Chang, of course, the minister has to also use his discretion. He has to use his best judgment, and there are some margins for discretion. But in this case here, there's only one extradition request from South Africa. If the charges are clear, if the evidence placed before the UAE authorities is clear, I doubt very much that the UAE authorities would refuse the extradition just because they want to please a large foreign investor. On the contrary, UAE will be very anxious not to be seen by the rest of the world as a safe haven for possibly illicit gains, for possibly stolen money.
Professor, I really appreciate the time and the insights. Thank you very much indeed. Professor Andre Thomashausen is an Emeritus Professor of International Law at UNISA. Sir, thank you.